The death of King Louis XVI marks a turning point, a pivotal moment when the radical revolutionaries claim victory and the French Republic is born in blood. By the end of 1792, the radical Jacobin faction, believing the young revolution to be threatened by traitors and foreign intervention, are resorting to more and more violent means. But the Girondins, representing a more moderate brand of republicanism, want to curb the violence, for fear it will lead to civil war. Their most vocal opponent, Jean-Paul Marat, strikes back at the Girondins with furious tirades in his newspaper, naming those he believes are plotting against the revolution. He had once called for the execution of 200 people. Now, he wants 200,000 heads to roll.
When you look at Marat's journalism, it's got one basic principle, which is be more extreme than anybody else and call for people to be killed. If you look at Marat's journalism all the time, he's saying, if only we chopped off a few heads, then things will be all right. And when things aren't all right, if only chop off a few more heads, things will be all right. Suddenly, people in Paris begin to massacre people. And Marat is the first to claim credit for that.
But this extremism hasn't taken hold everywhere. In the provinces, many are outraged at the brutality of the Jacobins and call for an end to the bloodletting. Charlotte Corday, a passionate and determined young woman, is one such opponent.
Charlotte Corday is an average person in the city of Caen. She's appalled by the killing that's going on there, and she, perhaps rightly, considers Marat one of the chief authors of that. He's been instrumental on the radical side of the revolution. His Ami du Peuple is still calling for heads.
The 13th of July, 1793, Charlotte Corday arrives in Paris. She knows that the friend of the people has an open-door policy at his home, where he can be found at nearly any hour, soaking in his medicinal bath. Corday arrives, claiming she has a list of traitors, people who are collaborating with foreign armies to end the revolution. Marat asks Corday for the list, promising that the traitors will be guillotined the next day.
Having given him that, she then produces a poignard, a little stiletto, and stabs him in the chest.
Marat is dead. The self-proclaimed wrath of the people has been silenced. The revolution has its first martyr.
When the revolution turns bloodthirsty, it's very easy to say it was his fault. And that, of course, is what those who hated him or feared him did say, and that's one of the reasons why Charlotte Corday actually murders him in 1793, because she regards him as responsible for many of the bloody atrocities that have actually occurred.
Corday makes no attempt to escape. At her trial, she is unrepentant and proud. When the prosecutor demands to know what she had hoped to achieve, she answers, "Peace. Now that he is dead, peace will return to my country." Corday is guillotined 4 days after Marat's death. Her dream of peace dies with her. She has killed the man, but created a legend. Marat's death is most famously depicted by the painter David.
He became a martyr. He became a kind of almost religious figure. You had people offering up prayers that went, "Heart of Jesus, Heart of Marat." You had these scenes at his funeral where the bathtub in which he was murdered was sort of put up on the altar, almost as if it was a kind of crucifix.
If you look at David's painting of Marat's death, Marat's body is draped in precisely the same way as the body of Christ is depicted in classic representations of the Pietà, the descent from the cross. So clearly there's an identification of Marat with Christ, with Marat representing the new kind of God of the radical republic.
Robespierre is envious of the adoration lavished upon Marat. But ever the pragmatist, he turns his attention to pressing matters at hand. Although Marat is dead, there are still others calling for blood, royal blood. The Conciergerie, Death's antechamber. 8 months after the execution of her husband, and just days after the killing of Charlotte Corday, Marie Antoinette is jailed here, in a small, dark cell, alone.
One of the worst things that happens to Marie after the execution of Louis is her children are ripped away from her. Her children were the most important thing to her, and she knew that her son was going to be subjected to terrible abuse to make him forget that he was ever royal by these revolutionaries. And it turns out she was right. It only took a couple years after that her son died of terrible neglect and abuse.
The once vain Marie Antoinette is only 38 years old, but events have aged her beyond her years.
Marie Antoinette had been a very pretty woman, elegant, until the Revolution. And from 1788-89, she got thinner, her hair went white. She abandoned all her pretty coquetry and her pretty things. She got very, very thin. When she arrived for her trial, she was unrecognizable.
On the 15th of October, Marie Antoinette is put on trial, accused of high treason. Most of the evidence offered is salacious and vengeful rumor. A final charge is added to the list. She is accused of incest with her son. At this, Marie stands to defend herself. I appeal to the conscience and feelings of every mother present to declare if there be one amongst you who does not shudder at the idea of such horrors.
And at that moment there was a change in the mood, because all the women felt that they were implicated, and they realized they had gone too far with these accusations.
In a moment of public sympathy, Marie hopes she will be deported to Austria. But her hopes are dashed when the sentence is handed down. She is to meet the same fate as her husband.
Marie Antoinette was, in a sense, doomed from the start. She was the symbol of this Austrian alliance that had proved disastrous for France. She was, along with her husband, a laughingstock because of the apparent sexual failure of their marriage. And she was a symbol of court culture at a time when people were coming to see the court culture itself as something completely corrupt and terrible for the country. So for all of these reasons, she was hated like no queen of France had ever been hated before. She was loathed, she was reviled.
From her cell, she writes a final letter, bidding farewell to her children and family, promising to be brave. Her long grey hair is cut in preparation for the blade. Her hands are tightly bound. As she is escorted out of the prison, she is expecting a carriage. Instead, there is just a tumbril, an open wagon.
She hopes when she's taken off to execution that she's going to get the same treatment that the king got, meaning she would be in an enclosed carriage so the crowd couldn't get her, but they just put her in an open wagon where people would shout all sorts of things, horrible threats at her.
A shadow of the sovereign she once was, Marie Antoinette maintains a queenly dignity as she sits in the open tumbril, paraded through the streets of Paris. Her name and the charges against her are read out. The last Queen of France is dead. 2 weeks later, after countless more executions, a member of the National Convention notes the pointless waste of life, as one colleague after another falls victim to the guillotine. The revolution is like Saturn, devouring its own children, he says. Danton sniffs. Revolutions, my friend, cannot be made with rose water. The bloodshed has only just begun. September 1793, 4 years into the revolution. France is being torn apart. There is violent insurrection in the provinces and huge losses in the faltering war against Europe. In a humiliating defeat, the British take the port city of Toulon. Europe is eating away at France's borders.
France, the single largest country in Western Europe, it's the most populous country in Western Europe. It has been the great military power. And of course, when it entered into the revolution, a lot of its traditional enemies and also a lot of its traditional allies thought, aha, this is our chance to, not to carve a piece off of the actual territory of France, but certainly to enrich ourselves at its expense and to weaken it permanently.
France is isolated in the whole of Europe. It's being blockaded by Britain. It's being attacked and invaded by Austria and by Prussia. The people of Paris are seized by a fear that the victory of the counter-revolution will lead to a bloodbath.
Danton and Robespierre, the star orators of the National Convention, realize that only drastic new measures can save the revolution. They convince their colleagues to institute a new form of martial law. It is time for all Frenchmen to enjoy sacred equality, announces Danton to the convention. It is time to impose this equality by signal acts of justice upon traitors and conspirators. Make terror the order of the day. It is the founding moment of the revolution's most infamous episode. The terror will come to symbolize Jacobin extremism and the corruption of revolutionary ideals. To meet the emergency, the new constitution and the rights it guarantees are suspended. Police spies scatter throughout the country. Anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity is rounded up, quickly tried, and executed.
The Reign of Terror was conceived as an emergency government. What they understood by terror was striking terror into the hearts of the enemies of the Republic, so that they would be either scared straight, as it were, or arrested and disposed of.
The slightest suspicion can send anyone to the scaffold. Politicians who say a kind word of the extinguished monarchy, anyone who uses the formal monsieur or madame instead of the new form of address, citoyen, citizen. Informers are everywhere. Neighbors denounce neighbors. The incessant rolling of the tumbrils en route to the guillotine rattles through the streets of Paris.
Execution is absolutely hanging over people's heads, in the sense that we know in Paris there are police spies, and there are quite a few police spies everywhere, standing in bread lines, listening to what the women are saying, and turning them in if they don't like what they hear. You could be turned in not just for complaining about the high price of bread, but you could be turned in supposedly even for not being enthusiastic enough about where things were going and the successes of the revolution. So just about anything that would stand out for commentary could get you into trouble.
The convention sets up the Revolutionary Tribunal, streamlining the process by which traitors can be identified and sentenced. Power is centralized in a new 12-man council called the Committee of Public Safety.
Ultimately, power had to be delegated to a smaller group, and that group became the Committee of Public Safety. Ultimately, it became 12 people who really ruled France as a kind of collective dictatorship.
With his masterful words and revolutionary vision, Robespierre soon emerges as the committee's guiding voice, and that voice is calling for more blood.
One of the paradoxes in Robespierre's political life is that he very early on is a passionate opponent of the death penalty. And of course this is thrown back in his face later when he becomes an equally passionate proponent of terror and the guillotine. He never particularly responds to that except to say, well, times have changed.
The revolution has hardened Robespierre. Once a fierce supporter of a free press, he now reinstates censorship. The Catholic Church, already mauled by the revolution, faces a new threat. Robespierre endorses one of the most radical revolutionaries, Jacques-René Hébert, as he proposes a program of de-Christianization.
When the crisis of the war and internal rebellion is at its height, people begin to say the root of all the problem is priests, is religion. And what we've got to do, if we're ever going to be safe against the enemies of revolution, is destroy the power of the Catholic Church. Superstition, fanaticism, that's what religion's all about, and therefore what we have to do is stamp out this whole thing entirely.
Streets carrying the word saint are renamed. Religious icons are destroyed and replaced with tributes to the new saint, Marat.
The church came to seem simply the enemy to the radical revolutionaries. Churches and cathedrals are simply stripped of their altars. Stained glass is smashed, statues are smashed, the wealth of the churches is simply carted off. Of course, for European opinion, this was something even more shocking than the death of the king.
Not even the Christian calendar is spared. Years are no longer numbered from the birth of Christ, but from September 1792, the proclamation of the Republic. It is now year 1. Months are renamed according to the seasons. July becomes Thermidor, April, Floreal. Months are broken into 3 weeks of 10 days each.
The revolutionary calendar was certainly designed as a kind of weapon against Christianity, against Christian belief. Of course, by having a 10-day week, you'd no longer have Sundays, so people wouldn't even know what day Sunday was anymore. That's what they hoped.
The terror spreads across France. Insurrections are put down with swift, unrelenting brutality. In the city of Lyon, where counter-revolutionaries are gaining ground, the National Convention's representative sets a brutal example. Hundreds of rebels are tied up, marched into fields, and mowed down en masse. The Vendée region in the west of France has also become a counter-revolutionary stronghold. Rebels and priests are tied up and drowned in the Loire, a national bath to accompany the national razor. Up to 100,000 people are killed in the Vendée alone. In Paris, the guillotine falls at an ever more frenetic pace. Now the French armies are beginning to win victories. With the help of a brilliant young commander named Napoleon Bonaparte, rebellious Toulon is recaptured and the Royal Navy forced to evacuate. The revolution is fighting back. Robespierre is at the height of his power. He had taken on the enemies of the revolution and ensured its success through terror.
For a time, the terror was very effective as a means of getting the country together, getting the government together, and fighting what was, after all, a war on several fronts. On the Eastern Front and on the Northern Front against external enemies, also a civil war in the Vendée, which was the bloodiest of all, also a civil war against the supporters of the Gironde and other revolutionaries who had turned against the government in Paris.
The terror has achieved its goals, but it does not stop, and it will not stop until it devours the very man who unleashed it, Maximilien Robespierre.